Coming up, the episode I've all been waiting for. That's right, the most cost-effective way not only to injure yourself seriously, but when you finally get there, when the ambulance deposits you, this is a surefire way to jump the queue and get straight into a trauma bay, neatly leapfrogging everyone whose kid busted, I don't know, their arm or their leg playing soccer earlier today. Who doesn't want that? Alternatively, I suppose you could reverse engineer everything I'm about to tell you and do a few non-stupid things and thereby avoid all of that. Anywho, idiots and angle grinders is next. I'm John Logan from AutoExpert.com.au. New cars cheap, but Australia only. Website. Card. Okay, so the reason one of these is the most cost-effective way to get yourself at the top of the queue in the emergency department is the barrier to entry is just so cheap, right? I just had a look at Bunnings' website. Less than $33 for the entry-level 100mm angle grinder. And this one's 125. It's sort of my go-to size for working around the joint. But they've all got one thing in common, which is the extreme high speed of operation. And you can become complacent about that very quickly. But let me put it to you like this. The peripheral speed of nearly all angle grinders is 250 kilometers per hour, which is roughly 150 miles per hour, America, or 170 revolutions per second with this particular one. But obviously the revolutions changes with the size because the material for the disc can only withstand a certain amount of centripetal sort of stresses. So this baby, 250 k's an hour, and that means if you're holding it here one hand and something goes wrong, then that's about 70 or 80 meters a second, so you're less than half a meter away. And even if the viscoelasticity of your body absorbs half of the energy, it's still going to hit you in like 10 milliseconds, right? Which is 1/10 of 1/10 of 1 second. You will not see it coming. There will be no Jedi-like ability to react. It won't matter if your finger is on the trigger or if you let it go, even though there won't be any time to let it go. It's just going to hit you out of the blue and you'll be playing catch up afterwards if there is an afterwards. So with other machines that can hurt you, like a table saw, the barrier to entry is like several hundred to a few $1,000s. If you're talking about lathes and milling machines, it's several $1,000s to end up in the same head of the queue position, center of attention in the emergency department. $33. And it's so easy to become complacent because the speed isn't that scary, and most of the time you get away with all kind of dipshit behavior. Speaking of which, the reason why I'm doing this video is because of the maker community on YouTube. There's this rise of a whole new class of human called the maker. And the maker makes stuff. They don't necessarily have a trade background or an engineering background or a design background or any kind of background in making stuff except the burning desire to make stuff. And I'm cool with that. I think more people should have a crack. The problem with that is with no training, you don't really know what can hurt you, right? And there's lots of things in the home shop, particularly a home metal shop, that can hurt you and hurt you badly, you know, and an angle grinder is exactly one of those things because of the number of degrees of freedom. You can use it any way you like, in any position. Seemingly, it's compatible with all of this stuff and the speed and the low cost. So that's why it's the most cost-effective way of doing this. The bottom line is most people are smart enough to know to leave the guard on. Most people, I think, although this might be a big call, most people are smart enough to use it two-handed, because if you're holding the job and using it one-handed, you only need a small problem to end up with one or more fingers on the floor, and you'd be looking around for a Ziploc bag and trying to staunch the bleeding at the same time. I mean, so many conflicting priorities, right? Two-handed operation is absolutely a must. Clamping the work with something else, even if it's just like a heavy shot bag or a bag of sand from Bunnings or something. You put it on top and hold something onto the bench. It doesn't have to be a vise, but a vise is a good idea. You could clamp it to the end of the bench, whatever. So much safer than freehanding. I see a lot of people freehanding. And the other thing I'd say is if you do this stuff all day long in a trade context, then you can probably massage the envelope just ever so slightly. But I wouldn't depict that for the newbie because the newbie's got no idea about what can go wrong. Okay, so let's assume you're smart enough to do all of those things. Wear some hearing protection, breathing protection, because metal dust is toxic, and the silicon carbide that does the abrasive work on this kind of disc, and also the zirconium for the blue ones, the zirconium, and the aluminium oxide. If you've got any red sort of sanding discs, they tend to be aluminium oxide. It's all bad for you. You don't need that in your lungs. The cheapest way to deal with that is just get a box of these P2 respirators. I think they're also called in some markets N95. Same thing, but you want at least that when you're grinding anything made of metal, and it goes up from there. You can buy better respirators and better cartridges, and you can even have forced air respirators like for welding, so that's all good. But you have to appreciate that even if you are wearing your safety specs and your respirator and all of that stuff, that's not a safe system of work. And people get this wrong. People who haven't been trained in industry get this wrong. So I'm inspired by the maker community because YouTube's AI recommended this video to me. A dude who grew up in the city, seemingly in America, has moved to a farm and he's doing farmer stuff. And he got clipped by his angle grinder, and he did a story about that, and to his credit he manned up and said, I got this wrong, but he also made a whole bunch of stupid assumptions, in my opinion, off the back of that. And I'm not going to name him, I don't want to shame him, the dude's already been hurt. But what happened with him was he buys this PTO whatever. It's a slasher to go on the back of his tractor or something. It could be anything, fertilizer spreader, who would know? But quite often you need some implement on the back of your tractor, and it's driven by a PTO, which is a drivetrain shaft that comes out of the anus of your tractor and goes down the throat of some implement like a slasher that you hang off the 3-point linkage on the back of your tractor. And the thing about a PTO is it's a splined power out and power in, with the shaft has a universal joint at each end to cope with changes in elevation, and the splines cope with the implement getting closer or further away from the tractor, and they supply the shaft, of which this is just a graphic representation, over length. And your job as Farmer Joe is to cut the PTO shaft off at the correct length for your application, for your implement and your particular tractor's anus. So our hero in this video, he's doing that, and he's got, I don't know, 80% of the way through the shaft with a Recipro saw, and for reasons known only to our hero, he changes to an angle grinder for the last 20%, which he proceeds to cut off the bottom of the shaft, and he's doing it one-handed because of freaking course he needs his other hand to hold the end of the shaft. So he's doing it like this, right? And this end is hanging out in space. And unfortunately, it grabs the disc, which is very fragile, and there's a kink of sorts, and then all kinds of high-speed mayhem ensue. The reductio ad absurdum of which is that the angle grinder ends up here like this, jammed into his chest, wrapped up in his shirt, and he also gets clipped just on the inside of his bicep here, although not in a major way. And he's figuring out how this happened after the fact. because there's no time to see it. It happens too quickly for that. He thinks it hit him in the bicep first and then went across into his chest, but I can almost guarantee that it hit him in the chest, got wrapped up in his shirt and dragged his bicep across into the blade. And there's a fragment of the blade deep in his chest, and he severs a blood vessel in his pec, and it's spurting a little bit, hilariously enough. He's lucky it didn't hit him initially here, because just on the inside of your bicep here, brachial artery runs down here, and if you damage that, that's a very serious problem with the plumbing, and the ambos might not make it in time. So on balance, he got off fairly lightly, but there was a substantial injury to his chest, and he ended up right at the front of the queue in the emergency department, as previously discussed. And he made all these erroneous conclusions about, wouldn't it be better if he got an angle grinder like this one with a dead man switch, on, let go, off. It wouldn't make any difference. It doesn't matter in this sort of scenario if the grinder is on and running or not, because it doesn't make very much torque. This is, I think it's a 900 watt grinder. I think it, yeah, 900 watts. 10,000 RPM. Power equals torque times revs. You've got to convert revs to radians per second, but anyway, that's what it is. What that means is big revs, small torque, still get a lot of power. So there's not much torque. It's not going to keep cutting after you stall the blade. You don't really have to worry about that. What you really have to worry about, what injures you, is the kinetic energy, the half I omega squared of all the rotating bits, mainly the disc. The second video I watched, because you know how YouTube's AI keeps, if you watch a particular video about a particular subject and it engages you, then all of a sudden you see a whole bunch of, you know, similar recommendations. So I got another one. It's almost straight away came up in the feed, and it was some dude in America. He's making a sheet metal brake out of 2 bits of, I'm going to say 50 by 75 angle. And he's got to notch out the angle for the hinges that you need to make the brake work. And that's all fine. He grabs his grinder to do the notching, and then he launches into this chat about safety, right? Which I found hilarious, because he's advocating one of these things, which is really good. This particular one, which I use all the time, is called a Bolle Sphere. They're super good. And in part because they protect you from impacts that might, you know, safety specs. I wear both when I'm cutting anything with a grinder, right? So safety specs plus Sphere Boy equals double layer of protection for your eyes, right? But also protection for your face, because it's no good if a piece of shrapnel misses your eyes and embeds itself in your head and severs a bunch of nerves, and you end up with, you know, endless rehab that you don't really ever fully recover from because nerve damage. So that's all good. He's given us the chat. He even says wear one of these things, which is a basic leather apron. Great advice, because it stops your t-shirt getting wound up in any problem, and it also provides, you know, a level of additional ballistic protection. So if a chunk comes off and hits you, it's likely to do less damage because it's got to get through the outside layer of a cow before it gets into you. That's good in my book, right? So these aprons are as cheap as chips. They stop the loose ends of anything getting entangled, and they're an extra layer of protection. So yay, approved. But then our freaking genius proceeds, because he's quite a stout chap, and he's working on sitting down on a bench, holding the grinder like this with his PPE on, in the plane of rotation, doing a spot of notching about 1.5 feet away from his junk, right? Now, in the plane of rotation. Now, I don't want to be discussing, you know, some sort of junk injury with doctors and nurses off my head on morphine in the emergency department, because I'm coming down into my fat cave for my mental health. I make cool shit and I don't have to worry about some of life's more malignant influences while I'm doing that, because I'm fully engaged with this, and you're probably the same, right? But these are the kinds of stupid behaviours that just, they proliferate, okay? So I thought it might be time to just talk about basic safety precautions with angle grinders. The two pieces of advice, one which is ubiquitous to all rotational machine operation, is get out of the plane of rotation. Get your head in particular out of the plane of rotation, right? It's like if someone's trying to punch you, you've just got to move this far, right? Boxers get really good at moving like this, slipping they call it, right? They slip, right? And that's because as long as you're out of the plane of rotation, it's much harder to hit you. Something's already got momentum. It's going to come at you in a particular way. And this is just like a series of fists at 250 k's an hour, potentially coming at you without warning, certainly without enough time for you to react. So the critical thing for you to do is to be out of the plane of rotation. And obviously, if you're grinding with a flap disc, you just keep yourself in an orientation like this relative to the machine. So you always look at this bit when you're using it, right? If you're looking at that, happy days, you're out of the plane of rotation. But if you're looking like that at something like this, right? If you're seeing that, that's very dangerous. And it doesn't matter what direction the disc is turning, it kind of does, but you don't want to be in the plane of rotation ever, because anything that breaks off and rebounds is going to come at you in the plane of rotation, thanks to Newton's first law. And the only real countermeasure is to be out of the way. So always like this with an angle grinder when you can. And same thing with a wire brush. I'm going to use this one like a left-hander. That one's rigged up for right-handed operation. This one's for left-handed operation. Same thing with a wire brush. If you're looking at the wire brush like that, you're pretty safe, like as you see it now. If you're looking at that and your hands are here and here, then that's pretty safe, dude. But if for some reason you end up looking down there like that, that's really dangerous, because any of these wire filaments can come at you like a little dagger. And I don't want to rely on the PPE to protect me. I want to rely on my fundamental use of the tool. The reason cutting, of course, is so dangerous is that when you're cutting, you kind of have to establish a line, and people tend to want to see down that line of operation like this. And that's so impossibly dangerous. We'll get to that. But this is also the case with lathes and milling machines and saws and all kinds of stuff. Wherever that plane of rotation is, you want to be on this side. If you're using like a radial arm drop saw, you want to be on the side of the motor so that everything in the saw is between you and the blade. It makes it much harder for anything to hit you. You're out of the plane of rotation, so you've got some sort of fundamental protection from Newton's first law, and you've also got the physical body of the machine in the way. And the compromise is, with your cutting, that you're not going to be able to see down the line as accurately. And to my mind, that's a fairly small price to pay when it comes to being in the front of the queue in the emergency department, which is a place you never want to be. Those doctors and nurses love doing their best work. The tragedy of that is you need to be having your worst day of your life to be in the front of the queue. So don't give them that opportunity, because sure as shit somebody else will. All right, now, because cutting is the worst thing that an angle grinder does, the best thing you can do is minimize the amount of cutting you do with an angle grinder. And there are so many alternatives. Now, obviously, this is an alternative, but I'd call it a good experience job, knowing how to use a hacksaw. However, if you have to cut, if you have to cut down a few nails, you could use a small pair of bolt cutters or, a hacksaw, whatever. You might just want to use them as pins to hang tools off on a tool board, whatever. If you need to do a small amount of cutting like that, a hacksaw is awesome. And I would argue that in the time it takes you to go and get your angle grinder and check the disc and then put on your PPE and run out of cord or get a battery, you could have already cut up the thing that you need to cut up if it's small enough with a hacksaw. So don't discount the old hacksaw. There's nothing wrong with a bit of elbow grease. You can also use a Recipro saw, like a battery or plug-in Recipro saw. They make bimetal blades for them and also carbide blades, which are really good for getting through steel. If I was our hero from the first example with a big hole in his chest shaped like an angle grinder disc, then I'd just use a Recipro saw to get through the end of that shaft, basically. And the other really cool alternative that I use all the time, that is one of the all-time great budget tools, is this. Now, this is exactly what it looks like, and it is one of my favourite tools for a couple of jobs that I do all the time. And I think I'm onto my second blade, and it's done hundreds of really heavy cuts breaking down stock, including serious stock like this. This is a piece of hot rolled 2-inch, like 50mm round bar, okay, and also pieces of, I'm gonna say 100 by 25 or 4 inches by 1, you know. And these come in dirty long lengths, both of them. I ended up inheriting a whole bunch of steel in, 4, 5, 6 meter lengths, and it's heavy steel like that. And I really don't want to drag it out several hundred kilos and put it in a bandsaw, like a fixed bandsaw somewhere, and then cut 4 inches off the end and put it back. It's much better to take a light little saw like this to the job and just cut through the piece virtually in situ. Just drag it out on the rack and cut through it in situ and get the piece that you need to machine, and then kick the end of it back in the rack, and the job is done. I'd also argue that this is faster than an angle grinder getting through something like this or something like this. So this is less than $200. It's a very low kinetic energy saw. It's extremely hard to hurt yourself using it. You'd have to really try. Like, you'd have to be a politician. You'd have to be that incompetent to hurt yourself with one of these babies. Whereas a genius, a Jedi, can hurt themselves with an angle grinder. And if you talk to any fabricators, Boilermaker fabricators, or anyone who works in the industry, they've all got their story about how they were this far from getting clipped by a 9-inch angle grinder, how the piece just touched them on the ear on the way past or something, right? They've all diced with death with the angle grinder. Whereas nobody dices with death with one of these. As long as you don't use it in the bath, you'll be okay, And this brings me to another thing about, fabrication generally. If you're breaking down stock, like steel comes in these ridiculous lengths, 8 meters long. You buy 50 by 50 by 5 angle, which is roughly 2 inches by 2 inches by, I'm going to say 3/16. Then it comes in 8 meter lengths, which are great if you've got a factory, because you can just forklift them in a big bunch off the truck and then put them on a conveyor system and feed them into a saw, and the conveyor is at exactly the right size for the saw, and the saw just chops them up into the parts that you need to make. And none of us have that. I certainly don't. So we've got to break down this stock, and it's highly inconvenient. And this is a great tool for that, whereas this is a totally shit tool for breaking down stock, because the stock just needs to bind ever so slightly on the disc, and then, are you in the plane of rotation? Did you get clipped by the rebound? Whereas if you're breaking it down with this, there's no danger of that. I mean, a part might move and jam the blade, but you take your finger off the trigger and it stops. And the worst thing that can happen is you break the blade, and they're like $10 each. So you're crazy if you don't have one of these saws. These are under $200, like a clean skin. I'm going to say it's about $170 for one of these. I'll have a link in the description, but I'd spend another $90 and buy the $260 version, which comes with a table that turns this into a pivoting chop saw. And it's also a mitering chop saw, so you can swivel the saw relative to the vise, and do your 45s or whatever other angle you want, and it takes up almost no space. And if you want to turn the table version into this, there's like 3 set screws here, 1, 2, 3, 1 Allen wrench, 3 set screws. 30 seconds later, you've got a clean skin. You take it over there and you break something down, and then you want to do some finer fabrication and get the parts to fit together with reasonable accuracy for welding. You put it back on the table and you finesse them up, and you haven't filled the shed with toxic dust, you haven't exposed yourself to the risk, and it's just generally been quieter and more pleasant and more accurate, because once you've got something in a vise and you're using a chop saw, you've got a better result for welding because the fit up will be better. Okay. The other thing that's really dangerous about using an angle grinder is if you're pulling some structure apart. Like, for example, you might have a vehicle on a farm with a homemade bull bar, and the corner of the bull bar might get clipped on a kangaroo or a rock or a tree or something, and you need to fix it. So you're going to cut that tubular side bit out and just replace it with another one, which seems like a pretty mundane job. But if you do that with your angle grinder, anything that's been fabricated has a lot of residual stress in it generally, and that's unpredictable. So what that means is you're cutting through it with your angle grinder. If that stress gets relieved quickly as the part separates, it can jam the blade without warning, and then you're in, rebound territory, aren't you? And that's really, really dangerous. So I'd be using something like this or a Recipro saw to pull any kind of structure apart, including doing repairs on anything that's been fabricated, like a trailer or, a gate or anything of this nature, because a lot of fabrication takes place afterwards. And the basic problem is that the weld pool shrinks and introduces some sort of stress into the structure, and you can't see it. But you'll certainly feel it if it relieves itself in the worst way when you're cutting a structure apart, which is why these low kinetic energy tools really are brilliant. And these import tools really are also hit and miss often, but this is one of the all-time hits. It's the most useful fabrication tool I've got, and that's a big call. But you get so many long bits of steel that have to be cut up to be made manageable. My life would be so much harder without this, and it does not place me at risk, which I love. The bandsaw doesn't throw sparks, so if you live in the bush and you're going into summer and it's really dry here in the pyromaniacal paradise of Australia, then it's pretty hard to start a fire with a bandsaw, and it's pretty easy to start one if you're working in the boonies or just in your backyard with one of these. So the thing about cutting that nobody talks about is, here's a right-handed person grinding, okay? I'm a lefty, but acknowledging that 90% of the world is not, here's what a right-handed person does when they grind. A left-handed person, same thing, it's just out here, right? Left hand on the handle, right hand on the body. And you're grinding your weld flat for painting, you're taking the edges off a piece of whatever, you're out of the plane of rotation, it's all fine, isn't it, And then you decide you've got to cut something. So, like magic, same side, you fit your zip disc. So you're good to go, right? If you're going to cut something off like here, cutting this handle off the vise, you do that. There's no problem with that, okay? The problem is when you're cutting vertically, and most cutting is done vertically, because the handle's already here, and people generally are not big thinkers, that's how they cut. And all of a sudden, you are exposed to the disc. That's bad. This bit of the disc is rotating close enough to me, like my ear is in the plane of rotation. That's how a lot of people cut, like this, right? Cutting on the vertical or cutting down here on the horizontal. I'm talking about the disc being vertical. What you've got to do if you want to cut on the vertical, meaning down like this on horizontal with the disc vertical, or something that's hanging out like this and you want to cut it off, then you've got to change the handle to the other side. Otherwise, you are massively at risk because you don't have the machine between you and the disc. And this part of the guard really blocks the blade, whereas holding it the other way, the guard only stops anything that hits the inside. If anything rebounds and comes out this way slightly, there's nothing to stop it, whereas there is on this side. There's the body of the grinder and the back of the guard itself. So it's so much safer. So I have to cut this spanner, and I have to do it because it's the right size. I bought it specifically to cut down. It's the right size for this thing. It's a machine tool part called an ER32 collet chuck. And it needs a 42mm spanner on the flats here so that you can get this thing, of course, not there. This thing, the collet spanner on here, right? So it needs to go into a milling machine, obviously, like this. You put the short two open-end spanner bits here, and you put the collet spanner on here, and you just do up the collet, and it holds a end mill or a face cutter or a tap or things of this nature, the sort of thing you wouldn't hold with Jacob's chuck. Anyway, all of the other tools I've mentioned, from the hacksaw to the bandsaw to the Recipro saw, are bad at cutting things like this or anything else that's been hardened. Even something small that's been hardened. I've got another job here that's got a hardened end, right? I want to make a pointer for a drill press, and I've got this screwdriver blade that's got the tip all shattered off. Right, so it's a really hard piece of steel. And I just want to cut it off here where I've made a small mark, make it about as long as a 5mm drill, and then go over to my ghetto lathe, which is Linisher, and get my battery drill and just grind a point on it. So then you put the blunt end in the chuck and you can lower the quill, and the point shows you exactly where the drill is going to be, which helps you get the vise in the right place before you clamp it and Bob's your uncle. Cutting this off with a hacksaw is going to be a comprehensive pain in the ass, and it'll probably ruin the blade in one go. Same thing with bandsaw. If you do that kind of thing with any of those tools with hardened steel. So cutting is great with abrasives when you're cutting anything hard. All right. So I'm going to cut this off with the zip disc because what is the alternative? But I am certainly going to cut them both like this. I'm definitely not just going to get the grinder in its default state, which for a right-handed person would be this way, and do that and place myself at a massive risk, not the least of which is that my arm is across. When I hold it like this, my left arm is across the plane of rotation, and if there is any high-speed rebound, I'm going to get a serious injury somewhere here that's going to require, all kinds of rehab that I don't want to practice. So you might think to yourself, I've been using an angle grinder for years, and that's a lot of extra time and effort. And I'd suggest that it only has to go wrong once. And that's why a whole bunch of safety procedures are philosophically hard to cop, because usually stuff doesn't go wrong. Usually you get away with it. That's just the nature of this problem. One of the other things you should probably also think about when you're using a cutting disc in particular, but also for grinding, is where are the sparks going? Because if the sparks are going, discs rotate like this, okay, in this direction. So anti-clockwise as you look at them this way and clockwise from behind the machine. So if you're holding the grinder like this, let's say, and the sparks are going directly away from you, like you're sighting down here like this, and if the sparks are going directly away from you, you are in the plane of rotation. The disc is rotating in this direction. If the blade gets caught, it's got all of this kinetic energy that cannot be destroyed. It has to go somewhere. So it's going to be a Newton's third law proposition, which means that the grinder will rebound in this direction. And that means it will come straight for your face, all right? If the sparks are going directly away from you. in a reverse scenario, where you might be using the grinder like this, for example, for whatever reason, then the sparks are going to be coming more or less directly towards you, which at least means that in the event of the blade getting caught, it's going to get thrown away from you, which is good, I guess, better than towards you anyway, but it still means that you're in the plane of rotation. So if the sparks are hitting you at all, you're standing in the wrong spot and you need to get the body of the machine between you and the disc, and then you'll be out of the plane of rotation. So look at where the sparks are going. Directly away is really bad, and hitting you is also quite bad. So try and be in a position where that doesn't happen. And I know the world's not perfect. So we're nearly there. A couple of other things that bite people all the time and allow those excellent personnel in the ambulance service and the emergency doctors and nurses to strut their best stuff are loose items of clothing, in particular the strings on hoodies or the big ZZ Top beard. Got to be really careful about them. If the hoodie string gets caught in the angle grinder, obviously this will be like a fishing line. You're the fish, right? Don't do that. So the strings have to come out of the hoodies. You're going to have to do something about your beard, okay? Not optional. Put it somewhere. Back up in the first floor bedroom would be my advice. Short beard, not a problem. Big ZZ Top beard, very, very dangerous. Now, gloves are another thing, right? It does look so butch, doesn't it? You put your gloves on. You got your mechanics impact gloves and your 511 tactical breaching gloves, whatever. You know, you're wearing your gloves. It's a complete off the chart safety violation to wear gloves with a grinder of any rotating machine, really. Gloves with a chainsaw, 2 thumbs up, okay? Gloves with an angle grinder, gloves with a drill press, lathe, milling machine, table saw, any of that stuff. Don't wear freaking gloves because they're an entanglement hazard. And when the entanglement is happening at 250 kilometers an hour, which I think it's written on the side here, it's got to be 80 meters a second. Yeah, 80 meters a second, okay? 10,500 RPM. It's moving 175, I think it is, revolutions per second, which is beyond comprehension. Certainly I can't comprehend it. If your hand gets entangled at that speed, there's going to be massive orthopedic damage, so don't wear gloves. Just, you know, you can disagree if you want, but every time you go in an industrial setting, every grinding machine, everything with a spindle that rotates has got these big signs that say no gloves, right? And it's there for a reason, dude. One-handed operation, obviously, that's ridiculous. The toxicity of the dust, you got to consider that. More of a thing in places like Canada in winter where one's home workshop is likely to be heated and closed because it's like minus 30 outside. Here in Australia, I've got dirty big 5 metre wide roller door on my garage and I just open that, and generally if it's not inclement, I do all the grinding outside because why fill the workspace up with toxic dust? And I still wear a mask, but obviously you should lower the concentration of any of that dust to the extent that it's possible to do so. And yeah, the other thing is the fire hazard potential. I spoke about bushfires, but there's a couple of things that people don't usually consider, one of which is fire extinguisher. I've got 2 fire extinguishers. One is 2.5 metres that way, just behind you. It's about 1.5 metres behind you, and another one is about 2.5 metres that way on the stairwell. And they're dirty big fire extinguishers too, compatible with the dry powder kind, so you can use them on electrical fires or liquid fires, anything, okay? Very important not to have to run to the other end of the property to get your fire extinguisher or think about what you're going to do. There's 2 other things about fires that people don't consider, and that is the work environment. Like, this is a good ghetto anti-spatter spray. It's just supermarket El Cheapo canola spray for cooking. And it works really good, and it doesn't smell like sweet embrace of death when you weld around on. It just smells like the fish and chip shop, which is kind of preferable, I guess. The problem with this, though, is that if you leave it out and you're doing some grinding or some cutting, and something happens and the sparks are coming over this way and it jams and the grinder gets thrown this way into the canola spray, you've got a source of ignition, the sparks and the abrasive action and the heat. And then you've got canola oil, which is going to function in just a second like napalm, because it's in here at significant but not ridiculous pressure with the propellant, which is propane gas. Okay? So if you think it's a good idea to clip a pressure pack can with an angle grinder, it's really not. This applies to paint as well, or any sort of spray lubricant, anything of that nature. It's just a disaster if you clip it. So before you weld and before you do any other grinding or heat violence type operation, just do a quick survey of what can burn on the work surface and get rid of it. The final thing is, in an automotive context, there's plenty of things that can burn, and angle grinders throw sparks everywhere, often highly concentrated. And often you're not looking at that because you're looking at the work, the job that you're cutting, grinding, polishing, whatever, and all these sparks are going over here like this, and you don't know if there's fuel or plastics or something kicking off. And I would say one of the best investments for automotive type use, and this would be welding and grinding and all this sort of stuff, is one of these. It's a fiberglass welding blanket. It's a fairly unremarkable thing, but really good at separating the sparks from the shit that can burn, in particular in your car. But if you're also doing work on location in a bushfire prone sort of area where there's just a risk of that, even if it's not a total fire ban or any of that nature, then you can set up just with a couple of sawhorses, or you can rig it up pretty easily just to put that blanket around and constrain the sparks so that you don't just smell that terrible smell of burning eucalypt and figure out that you just started a bushfire that risks lives and destroys millions of dollars worth of property just because you weren't thinking beforehand, right? So that's all I've got for you at this. The main thing is that you just be aware of the risks. I don't want to scare you off using an angle grinder because they are a remarkably versatile tool, and they're a real love-hate thing for me. I love what they can do, but I hate how much inherent danger there is in some of their modes of use, and how it really is on you and me. If you've got your hands on the tool, it's your job not to be in half an hour's time in the front of that queue trying to explain away, rationalize away how you were so freaking stupid, or you just made an honest error. Like, nobody cares. You don't even care that it was an honest error. You care that you've got an angle grinder shaped dent in your face, or an angle grinder disc shaped incision across your left eye or something, because this stuff happens every day and it keeps emergency departments busy, but it doesn't have to happen to you.